You never thought fear could have a flavor, but that night you discovered it. It had the metallic taste of blood when you bite your tongue to keep from screaming. Your sister Clara had woken up with a high fever, her skin burning like embers, and her chapped lips whispering meaningless words. The village midwife, a wrinkled woman who smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, had examined Clara with trembling hands before speaking the words that changed your world. Only the belladonna root from the forbidden wood can save her boy, but no one has returned from there after twilight. The weight of her words settled in your stomach like a cold stone, and you knew you had no choice. Clara was all you had left after the plague had taken your parents the previous winter. The sun had set behind the snow-capped peaks when you crossed the threshold of your stone and wood home. The night air hit your face with a breathtaking chill, and the wind carried with it the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves from the forest. Your fingers closed around the handle of your father's knife, a short but well-honed blade that had belonged to 3 generations of your family. The wrought iron amulet that hung around your neck felt heavy against your chest, and you remembered your grandmother's words, "Iron burns the creatures of the dark, grandson." Never forget that. Your breath formed small white clouds that quickly dissolved into the night, and each exhalation seemed to take a bit of your courage with it. The village's cobblestone streets were deserted, as they always were after curfew. The windows of the houses remained closed, with thick wooden shutters, and only a few rays of golden light filtered through the cracks, creating small pools of warmth in the gloom. Your footsteps echoed against the uneven stones, seemingly amplifying in the silence. The smell of smoke from the chimneys mingled with the scent of baking bread that still wafted through the air from the bakery, reminding you of the normalcy of a world you were about to leave. Your heart was beating so hard you feared any night creature could hear it from miles away. The chill seeped through your woolen tunic, and you could already feel the nervous sweat cooling against your skin. The thorn fence that marked the boundary between the village and the forbidden forest loomed before you like the teeth of some ancient monster. The intertwined branches formed a jagged barrier nearly 2 meters high, the thorns glinting with an icy patina in the moonlight. The iron-reinforced wooden gate remained triple-bolted, just as it had been for as long as you could remember. No one opened it after dark. Stories told of those who had tried to force it during the night, finding themselves smashed against the very thorns they sought to cross. Your hands trembled as you searched for the weak spot you'd known since childhood, a section where the thorns had grown unevenly, leaving a gap barely large enough for a slender person to pass through. The cold metal of the amulet touched your chin as you crouched down, reminding you of its protective presence. The first step into the forest was like crossing an invisible threshold into another world. The air immediately thickened, laden with a dampness that clung to your skin like invisible fingers. The scent changed completely. The comforting smells of the village disappeared and were replaced by a wild perfume of damp moss, rotting bark, and something else you couldn't identify, but that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Your boots sank into a carpet of dead leaves that crunched with each step, producing a sound that seemed to propagate far beyond what it should have. The full moon, which moments before had clearly illuminated the path, now filtered fragmentarily between the intertwined branches of the ancient trees, creating a mosaic of light and shadow that played tricks on your eyes. The cold intensified, but it wasn't the clean chill of the winter night. This cold had weight, a presence, as if it were a living entity. The trees surrounding you were unlike anything you'd ever seen before. Their trunks rose like columns in an unholy cathedral, some so wide you would have needed 6 men holding hands to fully embrace them. The bark was rough and dark, with patterns that looked like twisted faces when the moonlight hit them at a certain angle. The upper branches intertwined, forming a nearly impenetrable canopy, and occasionally something moved among them with a whisper that wasn't wind. The ground beneath your feet was uneven, covered with roots that stuck out like arthritic fingers and formed small pits where rainwater collected in puddles that reflected the moonlight like broken mirrors. Every step required concentration to keep from stumbling, and more than once, you had to brace yourself against the rough bark of the trees to keep your balance. Your breathing had become shallower, not only from the physical exertion, but from a tightness in your chest you couldn't explain. It was as if the forest itself was watching you, assessing you, deciding if you were worthy of passing. The sound of your own footsteps seemed amplified in the unearthly silence that reigned among the trees. There were no crickets chirping, no owls hooting, not even the wind rustling through the leaves, only the constant crunching beneath your feet and the rapid pounding of your heart in your ears. Every now and then, a branch would fall somewhere nearby with a dry snap that made you flinch, and your hand instinctively went to the knife handle. The iron amulet had begun to feel strangely warm against your chest, as if it were reacting to some unseen presence. You'd been walking for what felt like hours when you noticed the first change in the environment. The air grew even thicker, almost tangible, and you began to detect a new scent, something animal, wild, that reminded you of your neighbor's stable, but intensified 100-fold. It was the smell of creatures that didn't bathe, that slept on the bare earth, and that marked their territory with urine and excrement. Your stomach tightened with a mixture of nausea and primal terror, the same kind of fear your ancestors must have felt when confronted by predators in the darkness of caves. You knew, with a certainty that chilled your blood, that you had entered alien territory. The stories you'd heard since childhood no longer seemed like tales to scare children. Now they felt like urgent warnings you should have taken more serious. The first howl cut through the night like a knife slicing through silk. It was a sound you'd never heard before, but one you instantly recognized on some primitive level of your brain. It wasn't the howl of a common wolf, the kind occasionally heard from the distant mountains. This one had something different about it, something that spoke of intelligence, of purpose, of a communication that transcended simple animal instinct. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, bouncing between the trunks until it created an echo that lasted far longer than natural. Your legs stopped involuntarily, and for a moment that felt eternal, you were paralyzed between two equally powerful impulses: run back to the village or continue forward in search of the plant that could save Clara. The howl was repeated, closer this time, and was answered by another, and then another, until the forest was filled with a wild symphony that rattled your bone. The terror you felt at that moment was unlike anything you'd ever experienced before. It wasn't the fear of a fall or injury, but something much deeper and more primal, the fear of being hunted, of becoming prey to something that surpassed you in every way. Your hands trembled so much you could barely hold the knife steady, and cold sweat had spread across your forehead despite the frigid air. The iron amulet now burned against your skin as if it had been exposed to fire, and you wondered if that was normal or if it indicated the proximity of the creatures the legends spoke of. You closed your eyes for a moment, trying to calm yourself by recalling the image of Clara in her bed, burning with fever, but when you opened them again, the forest seemed to have become even more threatening. Every shadow could hide a lurking shape. Every movement of the branches could herald the arrival of something terrible. The moon had reached its highest point when you finally sighted what you were looking for. Among a natural clearing where the trees parted enough to allow the moonlight to shine directly on the ground, grew a bush with silvery leaves that shone with an almost unearthly radiance. It was exactly as the midwife had described, the woodland nightshade, whose roots contained healing properties found in no other plant. But there was one problem you hadn't anticipated. The clearing was about 30 meters away, and to reach it, you would have to leave the relative protection of the trees and expose yourself completely beneath the moonlight. The open space stretched out before you like a stage, and you had the uneasy feeling that whatever was watching you from the shadows would have a perfect view of your every move. The wind had completely ceased, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for your next decision. You took a deep breath, filling your lungs with the cold, damp air, and began to move toward the clearing with slow, deliberate steps. Every movement seemed amplified in the absolute silence that had fallen over the forest. Even the leaves beneath your feet had stopped crunching, as if they had magically become soft and silent. Your senses were hyperactivated. You could hear your own heartbeat like a war drum, feel every fiber of your clothing rubbing against your skin, perceive the slightest change in the air temperature. As you approached the center of the clearing, the feeling of being watched intensified until it became almost unbearable. It was as if dozens of eyes were following you from the surrounding darkness, calculating, assessing, waiting for the perfect moment to act. The iron amulet had begun to subtly vibrate against your chest, a strange sensation you had never experienced before. You were less than 10 meters from the plant when you first saw them. At first, they were just flashes of golden light among the shadows, pairs of glowing dots that appeared and disappeared between the trunks like giant fireflies. But gradually, as your eyes adjusted to the darkness, you began to make out the shapes that accompanied them. They were silhouettes that moved with feline grace between the trees, always staying at the edge of visibility, never close enough for you to see them clearly, but never so far away that you might forget their presence. The number of glowing eyes seemed to increase with every passing second until you realized you were completely surrounded. The clearing was no longer a moonlit refuge. It had become an arena where you were the only spectacle. Your legs trembled with the urge to run, but something in your primitive mind warned you that any sudden movement could trigger a reaction you couldn't control. That's when you heard something that made your blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps, but not normal human footsteps. It was a strange pattern, as if something that normally walked on all fours was struggling to stay upright on two. The sound was coming from behind you, from the direction you'd come from, effectively cutting off your escape route. You turned slowly, the knife trembling in your hand, and the amulet burning your skin like a hot iron. What you saw emerging from the shadows defied all logic and reason. A figure that was partly human and partly something else, something that shouldn't exist, but was there, real and tangible under the moonlight. Your mind struggled to process what your eyes were seeing, while a primitive part of your brain screamed to run without looking back. The approaching creature was taller than any man you'd ever met, but its posture was slightly hunched, as if it were used to moving in a different shape. Its body was covered in dark fur that gleamed with silvery highlights in the moonlight, and its limbs were longer and more muscular than humanly possible. But it was its eyes that transfixed you completely. They were golden, like freshly minted coins, but they held an intelligence no animal should possess, an awareness that assessed you with the same intensity with which you watched it. Its face was a disturbing mix of human and lupine features, the bone structure of a man, but with a splayed jaw filled with fangs that gleamed like polished ivory. When it breathed, the white steam that rose from its nostrils dispersed in small clouds that quickly dissolved into the cold air. Its hands, if they could be called that, ended in claws that looked like they could tear through tree bark effortlessly. The encounter stretched into a tense silence that felt like an eternity. The creature watched you with a curiosity that was almost more terrifying than any display of aggression. It tilted its head slightly to the side, a strangely human gesture that contrasted eerily with its bestial appearance. You could see its chest rise and fall with controlled breathing, and occasionally its nostrils flared as if it were analyzing your scent. The iron amulet around your neck had literally begun to smoke, creating small wisps of steam that rose from the hot metal. The creature noticed this, and its golden eyes fixed on the amulet with what seemed to be a mixture of respect and caution. For one terrible moment, you thought it might try to tear it from your neck, but instead, it simply took a step back, keeping its distance, but never taking its penetrating gaze from you. It was in that moment of absolute tension that you remembered why you were there. The image of Clara, burning with fever, cut through your terror like a beam of light in the darkness. Your sister was dying while you stood paralyzed with fear, and the plant that could save her was only feet away. With a determination you didn't know you possessed, you sidestepped toward the nightshade, keeping your eyes trained on the creature. To your surprise, it made no move to stop you. It simply continued to watch you with that disturbing intelligence in its golden eyes. You took another step, and then another, until you were finally close enough to the plant to crouch down and begin digging in the cold earth with your trembling hands. The root was deeper than you expected, and you had to dig for several minutes while feeling the constant gaze of multiple pairs of eyes on your back. The cold of the earth seeped through your gloves, numbing your fingers until you could barely feel what you were touching. When you finally managed to extract the entire root, a twisted structure, the thickness of your wrist and the length of your forearm, you slowly sat up, your prize firmly grasped in your free hand. The lead creature had remained motionless throughout, but now it emitted a low sound, something between a growl and what might almost have been a sigh. It was then that you realized the other pairs of glowing eyes had begun to stir, gradually approaching the clearing from all directions. They didn't come running or leaping. They moved with a calculated deliberation that suggested this had been planned from the moment you entered their territory. The circle of observers was slowly narrowing, and while none showed any signs of immediate aggression, their coordinated presence made you realize that you had been being steered toward this moment ever since you crossed the thorn barrier. The realization that you had been subtly manipulated to end up exactly where they wanted you to filled you with a new dimension of terror. The pack leader, for that was clearly what he was, raised his head toward the full moon and emitted a howl that was different from the previous ones. This one had a musical, almost melodic quality, as if he were communicating something specific to his companion. The sound was immediately answered by other howls from different points around the circle, creating a wild symphony that seemed to vibrate in your bone. But there was something about those sounds that wasn't completely hostile. There was a certain solemnity, as if you were witnessing some kind of ritual or ceremony. The iron amulet had stopped burning, and now simply felt warm against your chest, as if it had found some kind of balance with the supernatural forces that surrounded you. You wondered if this meant you had been accepted in some way, or if they had simply judged you as a lesser threat not worth eliminating. When the howls ceased, the silence that followed was unlike any you'd experienced before in the forest. It was no longer the oppressive silence of something waiting to attack. It was rather the expectant silence of a group that had made a decision and was waiting to see how events would unfold. The lead creature looked you straight in the eyes for a moment that felt like a final assessment, and then, to your utter amazement, it nodded once. The gesture was unmistakably human, a recognition of some kind you couldn't fully comprehend, but felt to your very bones. After that, it simply turned and began walking back into the shadows, moving with a fluid grace that defied its imposing size. The other pairs of eyes began to retreat as well, gradually disappearing into the trees until only a few observers remained watching for your eventual departure. You lay motionless for several minutes after the lead creature disappeared into the shadows, not daring to believe that you had truly been allowed to leave. The nightshade root felt heavy in your hand, tangible proof that everything that had just happened had been real and not some fevered nightmare. Your breathing gradually began to normalize, though your heart still pounded with the force of a hammer on an anvil. The clearing that moments before had been an arena of deadly tension now seemed strangely peaceful in the moonlight, as if nature itself had sighed with relief. But you knew you couldn't afford to let your guard down. You were still in the creature's territory, and the journey back to the village would be just as dangerous as the arrival. The iron amulet had stopped burning, but still emitted a comforting warmth against your chest, reminding you that you had at least some protection against the supernatural forces that inhabited these woods. You began your retreat with careful steps, keeping your head down, but your senses alert to any change in the environment. The forest had regained some of its natural sounds, the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves, the distant creak of branches settling, even the distant hoot of what might have been a barn owl. But among these familiar sounds, you occasionally picked up others that weren't so familiar. The rustle of something large moving through the bushes, the snap of a branch breaking under considerable weight, the distant echo of what might have been communication between the creatures. It was clear they were escorting you, staying close enough to observe, but far enough away not to alarm you. The realization that you were being protected rather than hunted was both disconcerting and reassuring. You wondered what it was about you or your mission that had stirred anything like compassion in beings who, according to all the legends, should have made you their dinner hours ago. The return journey felt different in the multiple ways. First, you already knew the way, allowing you to move more confidently among the twisted roots and natural obstacles. Second, the paralyzing terror had been replaced by a watchful but manageable wariness. And third, there was a strange sense that the forest itself had temporarily accepted you as if you had passed some kind of inadvertent test. The trees that had once seemed like menacing giants were now simply obstacles to navigate. The shadows that had once hidden imagined horrors now provided useful cover. Even the thick, stuffy air had become more breathable. The iron amulet stayed warm, but not painfully so, a constant reminder of the protection you carried. Occasionally, you noticed flashes of gold among the trees, but rather than filling you with terror, these sightings provided a strange reassurance, proof that your silent guardians were still monitoring your progress. When you finally reached the edge of the woods, where the thorn fence marked the boundary with the civilized world, you paused to look back one last time. The forest stretched out behind you like a dark sea in the fading moonlight, and for a moment you could swear you saw tall, slender figures watching you from the tree line. There was no hostility in their observation. It was more like a silent farewell, a mutual acknowledgement that you had shared something extraordinary. You raised your free hand to the iron amulet, which had now cooled to normal temperature, and nodded once toward the shadows in a gesture of respect and gratitude. You didn't know if the creatures could see your gesture at that distance, but you felt it was important to do so. You had entered the woods a desperate intruder and emerged a different thing, though you couldn't define exactly what had changed about you during those hours in forbidden territory. Sliding back through the gap in the thorn fence was considerably easier than entering, both because you now knew exactly where it was and because your hands were no longer shaking with terror. The thorns were still covered in frost, and some caught on your tunic as you slid through, but you managed to squeeze through without injury. Once on the other side, the contrast was immediate and striking. The air immediately felt lighter, less stuffy, as if you'd been breathing underwater and had finally surfaced. The familiar sounds of the sleeping village reached you, the distant barking of a dog, the creaking of wood settling, even the distant snore of a neighbor. These sounds, which a few hours ago had simply been part of the background of your everyday life, now felt extraordinarily comforting. You realized you'd been holding your breath without realizing it, and when you finally allowed yourself to exhale fully, it was as if you were releasing hours of pent-up tension. The village's cobblestone streets felt strangely solid beneath your feet after hours of walking on the uneven carpet of leaves and forest soil. Each step produced a familiar echo that bounced off the stone walls of the houses, a sound you had once taken for granted, but now appreciated as a manifestation of safety and civilization. The closed windows no longer seemed hostile, but protective, and the tightly shut doors with their iron bars were no longer symbols of fear, but of ancient wisdom. You wondered how many of your neighbors had had encounters similar to yours over the years, and how many had chosen to keep silent about their experiences to avoid being mistaken for crazy. There was something about the way the elders spoke of the creatures of the forest that now seemed less like superstition and more like knowledge. based on actual experience. When you finally reached your front door, you paused for a moment to process everything that had happened. The nightshade root was still firmly gripped in your hand, its rough surface and strange protuberances tangible proof that your mission had been successful. But beyond the physical object, you carried with you something less tangible, but equally real, the certainty that the world was far more complex and mysterious than you had ever imagined. The creatures of the forest were not the bloodthirsty monsters of folk legends. They were intelligent beings with their own codes of conduct, their own forms of communication, and apparently their own capacity for compassion, or at least respect toward the desperate quests of humans. You wondered if they had always been misunderstood, or if the stories of attacks and death had their origins in encounters where humans had failed to show proper respect or had violated some unwritten rule of the forest. The interior of your house felt like a capsule of warmth and familiarity after hours in the harsh environment of the forest. The fire in the fireplace had burned down to embers that still emitted a reddish glow, and the contrast between that warm, golden light and the cold, silvery moonlight under which you had spent the night was uncanny. The smell of wood smoke, baking bread, and the dried grasses hanging from the ceiling felt like a hug after hours of breathing in the wild, heavy scent of the forest. Your boots left small trails of damp earth and leaves on the stone floor, physical evidence of your journey that seemed incongruous in the domestic setting. You could hear Clara's labored breathing from her alcove, a sound that urgently reminded you why you had risked your life that night. Preparing the medicine was a process that required your full concentration, both to follow the midwife's precise instructions and to keep your mind engaged and prevent it from wandering to recent events. You had to grate a specific portion of the root into boiling water, let it steep for exactly the time it took to say 3 Hail Marys, and then strain it through a clean cloth. The process gave you time to calm down completely and to gradually process what had happened. As the water boiled over the fanned embers, you found yourself repeatedly touching the iron amulet, which now felt completely normal against your skin. You wondered if its previous warmth had been real, or if your fear altered mind had imagined the sensation. But the tiny burn marks on your robe, where the metal had made contact with the fabric, suggested that the experience had been very real. Clara awoke when you approached her bedside with the medicine ready, and the improvement in her condition was so immediate that you were speechless. The liquid had barely touched her lips when her breathing became less labored, and within minutes, the fever that had been burning her forehead began to subside. Her eyes, which had been glassy and unfocused all day, regained their usual clarity, and when she looked at you, it was with the expression of recognition and affection you had feared you would never see again. She asked you in a weak but clear voice where you had obtained the medicine, and you found yourself inventing a story about having obtained it from an itinerant merchant who had arrived late in the village. You couldn't tell her the truth, not only because she probably wouldn't believe you, but because something inside you felt that the events of that night should be kept private, like a sacred secret between you and the creatures of the forest. In the hours following dawn, as Clara slept a natural and restful sleep for the first time in days, you sat by the window, observing the forest in the distance. The sunlight had completely transformed the landscape. What during the night had been an eerie and potentially deadly territory now seemed simply an ordinary forest, dense and green under the twilight sky. But you knew that appearance was deceptive. Beneath that blanket of normalcy, parallel world existed, populated by beings that defied all conventional human understanding. You wondered if you would ever see the forest the same way again, or if your perspective had been permanently changed. The experience had altered something fundamental in your understanding of the world, expanding the boundaries of what you considered possible and filling you with a mixture of awe and respect for forces beyond normal human comprehension. The days that followed passed in a seemingly normal routine, but you carried the weight of the secret with you, like a second skin. Clara made a complete recovery in less than a week, regaining not only her health, but also her strength and cheerful spirit. Neighbors commented on the miraculous speed of her recovery, and some even suggested it had been divine intervention. You simply nodded and smiled, never revealing the true source of the cure. But occasionally, when you were alone, you found yourself gazing into the forbidden forest with an expression your neighbors would have found disconcerting had they noticed it. It wasn't fear you saw in your eyes, but something more complex, a mixture of respect, gratitude, and even a strange nostalgia for an encounter that had changed your perception of the world forever. One night, about a week after your nocturnal adventure, you awoke to the sound of distant howl coming from the wood. But this time, instead of filling you with terror, the sounds brought you a strange sense of tranquility. You quietly rose from your bed and went to the window, where you could see the silhouettes of the trees against the starry sky. The howls continued for several minutes, and although you couldn't be sure, you thought you detected a certain musicality in them, as if it were a song or a celebration of some kind. You wondered if the creatures remembered your visit, if they occasionally thought of the human who had entered their territory on a mission of mercy and made it out alive. The idea that you might be remembered by them filled you with a strange emotion you couldn't name. It was during that nighttime contemplation that you made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew you. The next day, when you went to the village market, you bought a loaf of the finest bread you could afford with your limited savings. It was a dense, nourishing loaf, the kind saved for special occasions, made with fine wheat and honey. That night, as the moon began to rise over the mountains, you walked to the edge of the village, where the thorn fence marked the boundary with the forbidden forest. There, in a small natural clearing you hadn't noticed before, you left the loaf of bread on a flat stone that seemed to have been placed there specifically for that purpose. No one was around to see your offering, and you didn't say any prayers or invocations. You simply left the bread and quietly withdrew. The next morning, when you happened to pass by the same spot on your way to the field where you worked, the bread was gone. There were no crumbs, no sign that common animals had found it. It was simply gone, carried off by unseen hands or claws during the night. The disappearance filled you with an unexpected satisfaction, as if you had completed an important ritual you hadn't even known existed. From that night forward, every full moon would find a fresh loaf of bread on that same stone, and each following morning, the bread was gone without a trace. It became a private tradition, a silent agreement between you and the supernatural inhabitants of the forest, a way to maintain the peace and mutual respect that had grown from your nightly encounter. The months passed, and your life gradually returned to familiar patterns, but with some subtle differences that only you noticed. You had become more observant of natural signs, the direction of the wind, the flight patterns of birds, the sounds of the forest that drifted back to the village. You had also developed a strange new confidence in situations that would have previously frightened you. When other villagers spoke with superstitious fear about supernatural creatures, you listened with an inward smile, knowing that reality was far more complex and less malevolent than they imagined. You had learned that the monsters of legends were often simply beings that had been misunderstood, and that respect and humility could open doors that fear and aggression kept firmly closed. Your relationship with Clara had also changed in subtle but significant ways. She never learned the true source of her cure, but she seemed to have developed an intuition that something extraordinary had occurred. Occasionally, she would catch you watching her with a thoughtful expression, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. And when other villagers spoke of the dangers of the forbidden forest, she always championed the idea that the creatures might not be as malevolent as the legends suggested. You wondered if she had somehow absorbed some of your experience through the medicine that had saved her life, or if she had simply developed an intuitive wisdom about the mysteries surrounding her. One autumn evening, several months after your initial encounter, You were leaving your usual offering of bread when you noticed something different about the stone. Next to the spot where you usually left the loaf, a small object had been placed that you hadn't noticed before. It was a polished stone about the size of your thumb, a deep blue color that seemed to absorb and reflect the moonlight in an almost hypnotic way. The surface was so smooth, it looked as if it had been worked by skilled hands, and when you picked it up, it felt surprisingly warm to the touch. There was no way to know for sure who had left it there or what it meant, but you felt instinctively that it was a gift, a token of acknowledgement or thanks for the months of regular offerings. You took it home and kept it in a special place by your bed where you occasionally touched it when you needed to remember that the world contained wonders that were beyond ordinary understanding. That stone became your personal talisman, a complement to the iron amulet you still wore but no longer seemed necessary. While the iron protected you from hostile forces, the blue stone seemed to connect you with benevolent forces, reminding you that you had found a place in a larger order of existence that included both the human and supernatural worlds. On nights when howls drifted from the forest, you held the stone in your hand and felt a tangible connection to the creatures that had chosen to show you mercy rather than aggression. It was as if you carried a small piece of their world with you, a physical reminder that the barriers between the human and the supernatural were more permeable than most people imagined. As time passed, your lunar offering routine had become as natural as any other household chore, but it never lost its special meaning. Each month, as the moon began to swell toward its fullness, you started planning what kind of bread you would bake for the offering. You had experimented with different recipes, loaves with wild honey, others with nuts collected in the forest near the village, some enriched with eggs when the hens laid more than usual. Each variation disappeared as completely as the ones before, leaving no trace of their existence. You wondered if the creatures had preferences, if they noticed the differences in taste and texture, or if they simply appreciated the gesture, regardless of the content. The total absence of crumbs or residue made you think that perhaps the act of feeding for them was different from the human process, something more complete or efficient that left no waste. One early winter morning, as you walked to the fields to work, you noticed something unusual on the path that skirted the forbidden woods. There were footprints in the damp earth, but they weren't the tracks of any animal you recognized. They were larger than those of a common wolf, with 5 clearly defined toes, ending in what were obviously claws. But the arrangement and depth suggested something that walked primarily on 2 legs. The prints led from the woods toward the stone where you left your offerings, and then back again along the same path. But most disturbing was that there were smaller footprints accompanying the larger ones, as if an adult had been walking alongside a young. The realization that the creatures had a family, that they reproduced and raised their young like any other species, filled you with a new dimension of respect and also responsibility. That night, when you brought your usual offering, you added something extra, a small round loaf, the perfect size for smaller hands. You didn't know if it was appropriate or if young creatures ate the same things as adults, but you felt it was important to acknowledge the presence of the hatchling you'd detected in the footprints. You placed both loaves on the stone with special care, making sure they were securely positioned and protected from the night wind. As you stood back, you thought you heard a sound you hadn't detected before, something like a soft whimper, almost like a puppy would make, but with a quality that suggested a more developed intelligence. The sound came from the direction of the forest, and although it lasted only a few seconds, it filled you with a strange emotion you couldn't fully define. The next morning, not only were both loaves gone, but in their place were 2 stone, the usual deep blue one, now accompanied by a smaller one of an emerald green hue that glowed with an inner light when the sunlight hit it at the right angle. The small stone had the same perfectly polished surface as the blue one, but its shape was slightly different, more rounded, as if it had been worked by less skilled or perhaps smaller hands. When you picked up both stones, you noticed they radiated different temperatures. The blue one maintained its familiar warmth, while the green one felt cool, but not cold, like a solidified spring breeze. You took them home with an overwhelming sense of humility, aware that you were now part of an exchange involving not only adult creatures, but also their offspring. Winter brought new challenges to maintaining your tradition of offerings. The ingredients for bread became scarcer and more expensive, and there were nights when the snow fell so heavily that you could barely find your way to the offering stone. But you never missed a full moon, no matter the weather conditions. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled through the village with a ferocity that rivaled the sounds coming from the forest, you wrapped yourself in every layer you owned and made the journey with unwavering determination. You discovered that on those particularly hostile nights, the gift stones you found the next morning often had new qualities. Some retained heat for hours after you picked them up, others seemed to repel moisture, no matter how long you exposed them to damp conditions. During one particularly severe blizzard, when the wind was so strong you could barely keep your eyes open, something extraordinary happened. While struggling to reach the offering stone with your monthly bread, you stumbled in the deep snow and fell heavily, striking your head on a hidden rock. For a moment, everything went black, and when you regained consciousness, you were being gently pulled toward a makeshift shelter formed by intertwined branches that provided protection from the wind. You couldn't clearly see your rescuer in the darkness and falling snow, but you detected the familiar scent of damp fur and forest earth that you had associated with the creatures since your first encounter. Large, warm hands helped you sit up, and a dark shape placed something warm in your numb hands. It was your own bread, but now it was lukewarm, as if it had been warmed near a fire. The shelter you'd been taken to was clearly temporary, built specifically to protect you during the storm. The branches had been woven together with a skill that spoke of years of experience living in harmony with the elements, and the ground had been covered with dried leaves that provided insulation against the snow. Your rescuer remained in the shadows of the shelter, but you could occasionally see the golden gleam of his eyes reflecting the little light available. He made no threatening movements. He simply sat silently, obviously waiting for the storm to subside, enough for it to be safe for you to return to the village. The heat radiating from his body helped raise the temperature inside the shelter, and you gradually stopped shivering uncontrollably. It was during those hours of enforced waiting that you realized you were experiencing something very few humans had, the genuine hospitality of a creature that, according to all legends, should have devoured you. When the storm finally began to subside, your protector got up and left the shelter, returning moments later with a long, sturdy branch that had been stripped of its smaller leaves to form a sort of walking stick. He offered it to you with a gesture that clearly indicated you should use it to help you on your way back. When you accepted the stick, your fingers briefly brushed what could only be his, warm, covered in short, soft fur, but with a bone structure that was clearly different from human. The contact lasted only a second, but it was enough to convey a sense of mutual recognition that transcended species barrier. Your savior accompanied you part of the way back, always staying within the limits of your vision, but close enough to intervene if you stumbled again in the deep snow. He only left you when the lights of the village became visible through the still falling snow. That experience fundamentally changed the nature of your monthly offerings. You no longer saw them simply as a gesture of respect or gratitude, but as part of a genuine relationship that had evolved over the months. The creatures of the forest weren't simply passive recipients of your generosity, they were active participants in an exchange that included protection, mutual care, and a form of communication that transcended language. The walking stick you had been given became a treasure you kept alongside your colored stone, and you occasionally used it during long walks, not because you physically needed it, but because it reminded you that you had allies in unexpected places. The wood had a special quality that you hadn't initially noticed. It was incredibly light yet extremely strong, and it never seemed to deteriorate no matter what weather conditions you exposed it to. In the days following the storm, you began to notice subtle changes in how the other villagers treated you. It wasn't anything they could specifically articulate, but there was something about your demeanor, your walk, your way of observing the world that had changed in ways others could subconsciously perceive. You had a new, quiet confidence, especially in situations involving the mysteries of the natural world. When others spoke with superstitious fear about strange sounds in the night, you listened with a serene expression that some interpreted as wisdom and others as a strange lack of appropriate concern. The village children had begun to seek you out when they wanted to hear stories, though you never spoke directly about your experience. Instead, you spun tales that captured the essence of what you had learned without revealing specific details. Clara, now fully recovered and more perceptive than ever, had begun asking questions that unnerved you with their precision. One evening, as you were preparing the bread for your next offering, she casually mentioned that she'd noticed your monthly special baking routine and wondered who the extra bread was intended for. Her question caught you off guard, and your stumbling answer about sharing with the needy didn't seem to completely convince her. She observed you with that penetrating gaze she'd inherited from your mother and simply nodded, but you had the uneasy feeling she'd connected more dots than you felt comfortable admitting. That evening, as you carried your offering to the usual stone, you couldn't shake the feeling that Clara had been watching you from the window of your house. Spring brought a new dynamic to your exchanges with the creatures of the forest. One morning, instead of finding stones as a gift of exchange, you discovered something entirely different in the offering stone, a bundle of herbs you didn't immediately recognize, bound with what appeared to be plant fiber braided with extraordinary skill. The herbs had an intense, complex scent that was both familiar and completely foreign, with notes reminiscent of mint, sage, and something else you couldn't quite place. When you discreetly showed them to the old village midwife, her eyes widened in surprise and something that might have been awe. "These are herbs from the deep forest, boy," she told you quietly. "They have healing properties beyond anything that grows in human territory. Where did you get them?" Your evasive answer only intensified her speculative stare, but she didn't press it further. Over time, the herbs proved to be exactly what the midwife had suggested. A small amount brewed as a tea could cure headaches that had persisted for days. Applied as a poultice, they could speed the healing of wounds noticeably, and even their scent had calming properties that could help those with insomnia find restful sleep. You quietly became a source of remedies for minor problems in the village, always attributing your supplies to trade contacts in distant towns or knowledge inherited from distant relatives. But inwardly, you knew that each successful use of the herbs strengthened your connection with the creatures who had provided them to you, as if you were an intermediary between two worlds that rarely interacted directly. The responsibility of this role filled you with both pride and a certain apprehension about the long term implications of your unique relationship. The seasons continued their cycle, and your routine of offerings remained constant, but the gifts you received in return began to become more sophisticated and varied. In addition to the colored stones and medicinal herbs, you occasionally found objects that had clearly been manufactured, small wooden carvings depicting forest animals with detail rivaling the work of the finest human artisans, vessels woven from plant fibers that were simultaneously flexible and impermeable, and even simple instruments like stone knives, sharpened with a precision that surpassed many tools made by professional smiths. Each object was clearly the product of sophisticated intelligence and skilled hands, further evidence that the creatures possessed a culture and technology of their own that were simply different from humans rather than inferior. One summer night, as you placed your customary offering on the stone, you heard something you had never detected before, the sound of what was clearly music. It wasn't music as humans would understand it, with recognizable instruments and familiar melodies, but it had rhythm, harmony, and an emotional quality that transcended species barriers. The sounds came from deep within the forest, carried on the warm night breeze, and seemed to involve multiple voices in a complex interplay that suggested both celebration and ritual. You stood motionless by the stone for nearly an hour, simply listening, absorbing an art form no human had ever documented. When the music finally ceased, the silence that followed felt charged with meaning, as if you had been privileged to witness something sacred and private. Summer also brought visitors to the village, traders, pilgrims, and occasionally scholars who traveled between communities, gathering stories and knowledge. One of these visitors, an older man who identified himself as a collector of folklore legends, showed particular interest in the stories about the Forbidden Forest. His questions were detailed and specific in a way that unnerved you, as if he knew more than he was initially willing to admit. For several nights, he sat in the local tavern, listening to the villagers' traditional tales of the forest creatures, but his eyes occasionally flicked toward you with an intensity that made you feel as if he were assessing your level of actual knowledge versus your diplomatic silence. Eventually, he approached you directly with a proposition that would change your life in unexpected ways. I've heard similar stories in dozens of villages throughout my travels, he told you one afternoon when he approached you while you were working in the fields. But there's something different about this place, something about the way people speak of the creature. It's not just fear, there's respect, even a kind of wary familiarity. And I've noticed that you listen to these conversations with an expression that suggests personal knowledge rather than casual curiosity. His words put you in an awkward position, caught between a desire to protect your secrets and curiosity about just how much this stranger knew. His next proposal was even more puzzling. I wonder if you would be willing to guide me to the edge of the forest. I don't intend to enter. I simply want to observe and document from a safe distance. I will pay well for your time and local knowledge. The request filled you with complex anxiety. On the one hand, the idea of bringing a stranger near the creature's territory felt like a betrayal of the trust you had built over months. On the other hand, this man seemed to be motivated by a genuine desire for understanding rather than exploitation, and his scholarly approach suggested he might be able to appreciate the complexity of the situation without reducing it to simple superstition. After several days of internal consideration, you agreed to take him to the edge of the woods for the day, on the strict condition that he stay a significant distance from the thorn fence and do nothing that could be construed as provocative or disrespectful. His enthusiastic acceptance of your conditions partially reassured you, but it didn't completely allay your reservations about the wisdom of this decision. The day of the guided tour proved to be more revealing than you had anticipated. The scholar, whose name turned out to be Master Aldrich, demonstrated a knowledge of supernatural lore that went far beyond what you had initially suggested. As you walked into the forest, he shared stories from other communities where he had documented evidence of interactions between humans and intelligent, non human creatures. The mistake most people make, he explained as he carefully surveyed the landscape, is assuming these creatures are inherently hostile. My research suggests that, like humans, their behavior is largely determined by how they are treated. Respect tends to breed respect. Aggression tends to breed aggression. His words resonated deeply with you, validating instincts and observations you had developed through your own experience but had never articulated so clearly. When they reached the edge of the forest, Master Aldrich spent over an hour simply observing and taking detailed notes on everything from the types of trees to the growth patterns of the vegetation to the characteristics of the soil near the thorn fence. But it was when he noticed the stone where you left your offerings that his demeanor changed significantly. Wordlessly, he carefully approached the stone and examined it from various angles, occasionally touching its surface with fingers that had obviously examined many similar objects in the past. Finally, he straightened and looked at you with an expression that combined respect, understanding, and something that seemed to be relief. So, it's you, he said simply. The middleman. I've been searching for someone like you for years. Master Aldrich's words struck you like a bolt of lightning on a clear night, leaving you momentarily speechless. Intermediary, you repeated, trying to maintain a neutral tone while your mind worked furiously to assess how much this man truly knew and what implications his knowledge might have. He smiled with an expression that combined understanding and reassurance, like a teacher who has finally found a student he's been seeking for years. Do not be alarmed, he said gently, noticing your obvious tension. I am not here to expose you or disrupt what you've built. Quite the contrary, I am here because I need your help, and I believe you could benefit from mine. His eyes, which until that moment had been merely curious, now displayed a depth of knowledge that made you realize you had gravely underestimated this seemingly academic visitor. The iron amulet around your neck began to emit that familiar warmth, but for the first time in months, you were unsure if the sensation indicated danger or simply the presence of complex supernatural forces. Master Aldrich sat down on a nearby rock, adopting a posture that clearly indicated he had much to explain and expected a long conversation. For the past 15 years, he began, I have been documenting cases of peaceful interaction between humans and what scholarly texts call intelligent non-human entities. Official histories always focus on the conflicts, the attacks, the tragedies, but those represent only a tiny fraction of the total reality. He pulled a leather-bound book from his backpack, and when he opened it, you could see pages filled with dense text, interspersed with detailed diagrams and maps. I have documented over 200 cases of peaceful coexistence from the mountains of the north to the swamps of the south. But in all of these cases, the crucial element is the presence of what I have come to call intermediary humans who, out of circumstance, necessity, or simple courage, have established communication and exchange with these creatures. His finger traced a line on one of the maps, and you realized it was showing a network of locations that stretched across the entire known realm. Why? You asked, finally finding your voice. Why seek out these stories? Why document something most people prefer to ignore or deny? Master Aldrich closed the book carefully before answering, and when he did, his voice held a weight that suggested motives beyond simple academic curiosity. Because the world is changing, he said. Forests are shrinking, wildernesses are being colonized, and the spaces where these creatures have lived for millennia are disappearing. In some places, this has led to conflicts that end badly for everyone involved. But in other places, where intermediaries like you exist, the transitions have been peaceful, even beneficial to both sides. He stood up and began walking slowly along the edge of the forest, clearly thinking carefully about his next words. I'm working on a project that requires the cooperation of multiple intermediaries, something that could change the way humans and non-humans interact in the future. His explanation filled you with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. On the one hand, the validation that you weren't the only one who had developed this kind of relationship was enormously comforting. On the other, the idea of being part of something bigger made you feel as if you were losing control over a situation you had come to consider intimate and personal. What kind of project? You asked, though part of you wasn't sure you wanted to know the answer. Master Aldrich stopped in his pacing and looked directly at you, and in his eyes you could see the passion of someone who had dedicated his life to a cause he believed in deeply. I'm establishing a communications network, he said, a way for different communities of non-human creatures to communicate with each other, and when necessary, with human authorities. Too many conflicts arise from misunderstanding, from mutual fear, from a lack of channels to resolve disputes before they escalate into violence. The audacity of his vision left you momentarily speechless. But it also made you realize that what you had been doing for months could be part of something much more significant than you had imagined. The creatures you've been exchanging with, he continued, belong to what my studies have identified as one of the most sophisticated and diplomatically inclined communities I've encountered. If I could establish formal communication with them, they could serve as ambassadors to other communities of their kind in distant regions. The idea that your mysterious nocturnal benefactors might be part of a wider social network had never occurred to you, but it made sense when you thought about it. The gifts you'd received displayed a level of skill and sophistication that suggested a developed culture, and the music you'd heard that summer night clearly indicated complex artistic traditions. But, Master Aldrich added, with a seriousness that underscored the importance of his next words, any formal approach must be made through established channels of trust. I can't simply appear on their territory and expect to be received peacefully. I need someone they already trust to make the initial introduction. The weight of what he was asking of you settled upon you like a physical burden. For months, you had kept your relationship with the creatures on a simple and intimate level, offerings of food in exchange for gifts and occasional protection. The idea of expanding that relationship into something formal, diplomatic, potentially political, filled you with anxiety. What if you misinterpreted the creature's intentions? What if introducing an outside element destroyed the delicate trust you had built? I need time to think, you told him finally, and I need to consult. You didn't specify with whom you needed to consult, but Master Aldrich nodded understandingly. Of course, this kind of decision should not be taken lightly. I will be in the village for another week, documenting the local traditions. When you are ready to talk, simply seek me out. With that, he began packing up his material. But before he walked away completely, he left you with a warning that chilled your blood. Be careful who else you talk to about this. Not everyone who seeks knowledge about these creatures has purely academic intentions. That night, as you prepared your usual lunar offering, your hands trembled with more than the season's chill. The conversation with Master Aldrich had changed everything, transforming your private exchange into something potentially public, your personal relationship into something potentially political. When you reached the offering stone, you placed the bread down with more care than usual, and then you did something you'd never done before. You spoke aloud, heading into the darkness of the forest. There's someone who wants to meet you, you said, feeling strange about breaking the silence that had always characterized these exchanges. He says he can help, that he can make things better for all of us, but I don't know if I should trust him, and I don't know if you would want to meet him. Your voice faded into the night, and for a moment that felt eternal, there was only silence. Then, from the depths of the forest, came an answer, a long, modulated howl that sounded like none you'd heard before. It had an almost interrogative quality, as if it were a question rather than a statement. The next morning brought a surprise that confirmed your message had been received and understood. Instead of the usual gifts, you found something entirely new in the stone, a small wooden carving that clearly depicted a human standing next to a wolf-like creature, both looking toward a third figure that remained partially in the shadows. The detail was extraordinary. You could see expressions on the carved faces that suggested wariness, but also curiosity. But most significantly, the human figure in the carving wore an amulet around its neck that was identical to yours, suggesting that the creatures had not only understood your message, but also had a clear understanding of who you were in this situation. The figure in the shadows was carrying what appeared to be a book, and you realized that somehow the creatures had observed your encounter with Master Aldrich and incorporated that information into their response. When you showed the carving to Master Aldrich that afternoon, his eyes lit up with an excitement bordering on reverence. This is extraordinary, he exclaimed, examining every detail of the small sculpture, the level of observation, the symbolic understanding, the direct response to verbal communication. This is beyond anything I've documented before. He turned the carving over in his hands, clearly fascinated by the artistry as much as by its communicative implication. Can I interpret this as an indication that they are willing to consider a meeting? His enthusiasm was contagious, but it also reminded you that you were dealing with forces that might be beyond your ability to control or fully understand. I think so, you answered carefully, but we need to proceed very slowly. They've obviously been watching us, which means they're cautious. Any hasty moves could ruin years of trust building. The days that followed were filled with careful preparation. Master Aldrich shared with you some of the protocols he had developed for formal first encounters with non human creatures. Never carry weapons, wear neutral colors in your clothing, move slowly, and keep your hands visible at all times. And above all, allow the creatures to control the pace and nature of the interaction. He also gave you a small, polished metal mirror, which he explained was a traditional gift in many non human cultures because it allowed them to see their own reflections, something they valued for reasons he didn't fully understand but had consistently observed. You felt as if you were preparing for a religious ceremony rather than a simple meeting, and the analogy didn't seem inappropriate given how sacred he had come to consider your relationship with the creatures of the forest. The night chosen for the meeting was one when the moon would be at its brightest, providing the maximum possible illumination, but also maximizing any effect the moonlight might have on the creatures. You met Master Aldrich at the edge of the village an hour before midnight, and together you walked into the forest in a silence thick with anticipation and nervousness. He had followed your every suggestion regarding dress and behavior, but he still moved with the stiffness of someone out of their natural element. When you reached the offering stone, you placed down not only the usual bread, but also the mirror Master Aldrich had brought, along with a small sample of the finest healing herbs that grew in human territory. It was a more elaborate offering than usual, designed to communicate the special significance of this occasion. For the first hour after the offerings were placed, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Master Aldrich remained patiently still, occasionally taking discreet notes in a small notebook, but mostly just watching and waiting. You began to wonder if the creatures had decided they weren't interested in the encounter after all, or if the presence of a stranger had altered the dynamic in a way that made them feel unsafe. But then, just as you were beginning to consider suggesting they retreat and try another time, you heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching from deeper within the forest. But this time, they were multiple sets of footsteps, suggesting that more than one creature was approaching. The pattern of the sounds was deliberately audible, clearly meant to announce their approach rather than conceal it. The first creature to emerge from the shadows was the same one you had encountered that first night months ago, tall, powerful, with those unmistakable golden eyes that shone with penetrating intelligence. But now she wasn't alone. Two additional creatures accompanied her, one slightly smaller that moved with the grace of someone accustomed to acting as second in command, and another that was obviously younger but carrying what were clearly ornaments or symbols of some kind of rank or specialization. They all moved with the same combination of controlled power and diplomatic caution, and when they stopped at a distance that allowed communication but maintained a safe space, they assumed postures that were clearly ceremonial. The leader inclined his head slightly in your direction, a gesture of acknowledgement I had come to associate with respect, and then turned his golden attention toward Master Aldrich with an evaluative intensity that would have been intimidating under any circumstances. Master Aldrich, for his part, behaved exactly as you'd expected someone with his experience to do. He moved slowly and deliberately, keeping his hands visible and adopting a posture that was respectful without being servile. When he spoke, his voice was low and clear, addressing the leader, but occasionally glancing toward you, as if seeking confirmation that he was proceeding appropriately. I am a student of the relations between different peoples, he began. I have come here not to take or demand, but to learn and, if possible, to help build understanding between communities that have lived apart for too long. His words were carefully chosen to avoid any implication of superiority or invasion, but also to communicate serious purposes that went beyond casual curiosity. The leader listened intently, occasionally tilting his head slightly, as if considering not only the words, but also the intentions behind them. What followed was a form of communication unlike any you had ever witnessed before. The creatures did not speak in the human sense, but they produced a variety of vocal sounds that clearly constituted a sophisticated language, modulated moans, grunts with varying pitches and durations, and even some sounds that vaguely resembled words but were formed by vocal cords that were obviously structured differently than human ones. But beyond the vocal sounds, they communicated through complex gestures, changes in posture, and even movements of their ears and tails that conveyed specific information. Master Aldrich watched all of this with obvious fascination, occasionally taking notes, but mostly simply absorbing a display of intelligence and culture that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. You served as a kind of emotional translator, interpreting the creature's body language for Master Aldrich and helping him calibrate his own responses appropriately. After nearly an hour of this complex communication, something extraordinary happened. The younger creature, which until then had remained in the background, silently watching, stepped forward and produced a sequence of sounds that were clearly directed specifically at Master Aldrich. The tones were different from those they had been using among themselves, simpler, more deliberate, as if it were attempting to adapt its communication to the limitations of human understanding. To your complete surprise, Master Aldrich responded with a series of sounds that, while clearly produced by human vocal cords, bore enough similarity to the creature's patterns to generate a response of recognition. I've been studying your languages for years, he explained to you in a whisper, without taking his eyes off the creatures. Each community has different dialects, but there are certain universal patterns that seem to work for basic communication. The revelation that he had been withholding this knowledge shocked you, but it also made you appreciate the level of preparation he had brought to this encounter. The ensuing conversation, though limited by language barriers and the need to proceed cautiously, established several important points. First, the creatures were aware of Master Aldrich's work in other regions. Somehow, communication networks between different non human communities already existed and functioned more efficiently than he had anticipated. Second, they were interested in the concept of establishing formal channels of communication with human authorities, but only under very specific conditions that would guarantee their autonomy and safety. And third, they regarded your role as intermediary as far more significant than you yourself had realized. You were not simply someone who had stumbled upon them by accident, but had been assessed and chosen for this role based on qualities they valued but were unwilling to fully explain. This revelation filled you with a mixture of pride and overwhelming responsibility, as if you had been assigned an official position you had never applied for, but had apparently been performing without knowing it. When the meeting finally came to a close, the creatures had set the terms for a more formal future meeting involving additional representatives from their community and possibly allied communities. But they made it clear that this meeting would only take place if certain conditions were met. Master Aldrich would have to provide evidence that he had official authorization to negotiate on behalf of the relevant human authority. He would have to bring written assurances that any agreement reached would be honored by all human parties, and most importantly, the entire process would have to unfold through you as the official intermediary. They were unable or unwilling to deal directly with the human authorities without the mediation of someone they already trusted. This last condition fundamentally transformed your life. You were no longer simply someone who had developed an interesting personal relationship with mysterious creatures, but had become an official diplomat in a process that could change the history of interspecies relations. The days following the meeting were filled with intense activity. Master Aldrich departed the village to make arrangements with the higher authorities, but before leaving, he handed you a series of documents that, he explained, gave you legal status as an authorized cultural representative on behalf of the crown. The documents were sealed with official wax and bore signatures that, though you didn't recognize them, clearly represented levels of authority far above anything you'd previously had contact with. This protects you, he explained as he packed his materials. If anyone questions your authority to act in this capacity, these documents should be enough to validate your position. But more importantly, they give you access to resources if you need them: travel funds, authorization to requisition transportation if necessary, and even military protection if the situation becomes dangerous. The idea that your situation could become dangerous had never seriously occurred to you, but Master Aldrich's caution made you realize you were entering political territory where mistakes could have far more serious consequences than the loss of a personal relationship. While you waited for Master Aldrich's return with the necessary documents and authorities, your routine of monthly offerings took on a new dimension. The creatures had begun leaving materials that were clearly meant to help prepare you for your new role. Maps carved into bark showing the territories of different non human communities in the region. Objects that appeared to be symbols of authority or identification that you might need when interacting with other creatures, and even something that resembled a protocol manual etched on a metal plates that required hours of careful study to decipher. You realized that for months you had been unknowingly being groomed for this role, and that the creatures had been assessing not only your character, but also your capacity for learning and adaptation. The sophistication of the materials they provided made you appreciate that their culture included systems of education and preparation that rivaled anything in the human world. Clara had noticed the changes in your behavior and routine and finally confronted you directly about what was happening. One evening, when you returned home after spending hours studying the materials the creatures had left behind, she was waiting for you with an expression that combined concern, curiosity, and impatience. Brother, she said without preamble, something has changed in you since that scholar visited our village. You're acting like someone carrying a burden you never had before, and I've noticed that your night walks have become more frequent and longer. Her observation was too accurate to convincingly deny, and you realized that the time had come to share at least some of the truth with the most important person in your life. But explaining your situation required revealing secrets that weren't completely under your control, and you weren't sure how much you could share without violating the trust you had worked so hard to build. Do you remember when you were sick? You began carefully, deciding the best approach was to start with something she knew to be real and gradually expand from there. Do you remember how I got the medicine that cured you? Clara nodded, but her expression indicated she'd connected dots that had been floating around in her mind for months. You didn't buy it from a traveling merchant, she said. It wasn't a question so much as a statement of certainty. You got it from the forbidden forest, didn't you? Her instinctive grasp of the situation surprised you, but also relieved you because it meant you wouldn't have to convince her of the reality of something that sounded impossible. Yes, you admitted, and that wasn't the only time I interacted with the forest dwellers. For the next hour, you told her an edited version of your experiences, focusing on the aspects of peaceful exchange and trust building, while downplaying elements that might unnecessarily alarm her. Her reaction was more pragmatic than you had expected. Rather than expressing terror or disbelief, Clara asked specific questions about the practical details of your interactions, what kinds of offerings worked best, how you interpreted the creature's signs, what you had learned about their culture and social organization. It was as if she had been anticipating this conversation for months and had used that time to mentally prepare the kind of information she would need to fully understand the situation. And now you've become some kind of ambassador, she asked when you finished your explanation. Is that why that scholar was really here? Her ability to draw out the broader implications of the information you had shared reminded you that she had inherited the same practical intelligence that had made your mother one of the most respected women in the village. Basically, yes, you replied. And that means things are going to change for us, probably in ways I can't fully predict yet. The weeks that followed your conversation with Clara were marked by a series of preparations that gradually transformed not only your life, but also that of your entire family. First, official messengers arrived with documents establishing a sizable monthly allowance for your new position, enough so that you would never again have to worry about basic financial matters. Then came materials, books on diplomacy and negotiation, detailed maps of regions that extended far beyond your local knowledge, and even clothing appropriate for formal occasions that might require you to represent your position before important human audiences. But perhaps most significant was the arrival of an assistant, a young scribe named Marcus, who had been specifically trained to work with cultural intermediaries and who had experience documenting agreements between groups with different communication traditions. His presence made you realize that your situation had evolved beyond something you could handle alone, and that you were now part of a government operation with scopes and objectives that extended far beyond your initial understanding. Marcus proved to be a valuable addition in ways you hadn't anticipated. His training included knowledge of multiple writing systems and documentation methods that might be necessary to record agreements with cultures that didn't use conventional writing. But more importantly, he had previously worked with other non human communities and had a working understanding of the challenges involved in building trust across species barriers. The key, he explained to you during one of his first nights at your home, is to remember that every culture has its own concepts of time, protocol, and meaning. What seems like a lack of response on their part could simply be a difference in how they process and respond to new information. His perspective helped you recontextualize some of your previous interactions and gave you tools to navigate the complexities that were sure to arise in future, more formal negotiations. Master Aldrich's return, accompanied by an official delegation that included representatives from both the regional government and the church, marked the beginning of a new phase in your development as a broker. The delegation had set up a temporary camp on the outskirts of the village, close enough to facilitate communication, but far enough away to avoid intimidating the local population with an obvious military presence. When you met with them for the first official briefing, you found yourself seated at a table with people whose decisions affected the lives of thousands, discussing strategies for negotiations that could set precedents for interspecies relations for generations to come. The surreality of the situation hit you hard. Less than a year ago, you had been merely a desperate peasant seeking medicine for his ailing sister, and now you were a central figure in events that could change the course of history. The weight of responsibility was almost overwhelming, but there was also an undeniable thrill in knowing you were contributing to something that could make the world a better place for everyone involved. The first formal meeting between the human delegation and the representatives of the forest creatures was scheduled for the night of the new moon, when darkness would provide maximum comfort for the creatures, while special torches would create enough illumination for the humans to function effectively. The chosen location was the same clearing where you had originally found the nightshade, a space that held meaning for both you and the creatures and had been mutually agreed upon as neutral territory. For days leading up to the meeting, both humans and creatures had been sending subtle signals through you, establishing basic protocols. Neither side would bring weapons. Numbers would be limited to 5 representatives per side, and you would have final authority to suspend negotiations if either side violated the agreements of mutual respect. The pressure of serving as the final arbiter in such a delicate situation, kept you awake at night, mentally going over every possible scenario and the ways things could go wrong. By the time the appointed night arrived, your nervousness had reached near paralyzing level. You had dressed in the finest clothes you owned, but had kept the iron amulet hidden beneath your shirt, along with the blue stone you had received months ago. Marcus had prepared writing materials with multiple types of ink and writing surfaces, recognizing that different cultures might have specific preferences for how important agreements were recorded. The human delegation had arrived at the clearing an hour ahead of schedule, establishing a respectful yet visible presence that communicated gravitas without aggression. The delegation's leader, an older man named Lord Garrett, who had spent decades negotiating complex trade treaties, had positioned himself to make it clear that you were the primary communicator while he provided backup authority. His experience with delicate diplomatic situations showed in every aspect of his posture and demeanor, and his presence gave you confidence that at least the human side of the negotiation would be handled professionally. The creatures arrived exactly at midnight, emerging from the darkness of the forest with a precision that suggested they had been watching and waiting for the exact right moment. But the group that appeared this time was unlike anything you had seen before, led by the familiar creature you had come to think of as your primary contact, but accompanied by individuals who clearly represented different aspects of their society. One wore ornaments that suggested religious or spiritual authority. Another had markings on his fur that seemed to indicate military or security rank. A third carried objects that were obviously tools of some sort of specialized trade. And the fifth was clearly the oldest of the group, with silvery gray fur and a presence that communicated ancient wisdom. Their arrangement around the clearing was deliberately symmetrical to that of the human delegation, creating a sense of balance that helped set the appropriate tone for the negotiations that would follow. Initial communication took place primarily through you, with Master Aldrich providing additional translation when his linguistic skills could clarify specific points. But gradually, a more complex pattern emerged where different members of each delegation interacted directly according to their areas of expertise. The human trade representative developed a rudimentary form of communication with the creature carrying specialized tools, using diagrams drawn in the earth to discuss concepts of resource exchange. The human cleric found an unexpected resonance with the creature wearing spirit ornaments, and although their communication was limited, both seemed to recognize common ritual elements in their respective traditions. But it was the interaction between Lord Garrett and the ancient creature that set the true framework for the agreements to follow, a form of communication that transcended language and was based on universal gestures of respect, authority, and diplomatic intent. During the first 3 hours of negotiations, the basic principles that would govern any formal agreement were established. First, the mutual recognition that both humans and creatures had legitimate rights to territory and resources, and that any disputes over boundaries or resource use should be resolved through negotiation rather than conflict. Second, the establishment of your position as a permanent intermediary with the authority to communicate between the parties and make minor decisions without requiring consultation with higher authority. Third, the creation of a system of signals and protocols that would allow for rapid communication in case of emergencies or misunderstanding. And fourth, the agreement that both sides would work to educate their respective communities about the existence of these agreements and the importance of respecting them. Each point required careful explanation and multiple confirmations to ensure that both sides understood not only the words, but also the implications of what they were agreeing to. When negotiations moved to more specific issues, cultural differences became both a challenge and a learning opportunity. The creatures had concepts of property that were fundamentally different from humans. Rather than owning land in the human sense, They had caretaking responsibilities that ran through family lines and included obligations both to the territory and to the other species that inhabited it. Their economic system was based on the exchange of services and knowledge rather than the accumulation of material goods, which required a complete rethinking of how trade agreements would be structured. But these differences also provided opportunities for each side to learn alternative approaches to common problems. Humans discovered resource management methods that were more sustainable in the long term, while the creatures became interested in human technology that could improve their quality of life without compromising with their core cultural values. The most tense moment of the entire negotiation came when the issue of enforcement of the agreement was discussed. The humans were accustomed to legal systems that relied on centralized authority and formal punishments for violations, while the creatures operated under a more personal and restorative system of justice that emphasized reparation and community reconciliation. The elder creature spent nearly an hour explaining through gestures, diagrams, and the limited elements of common language they had developed how their system could be adapted to include violations committed by humans, while Lord Garrett struggled to find ways to explain how human laws could be modified to recognize and accommodate alternative forms of justice. It was your suggestion that ultimately provided the solution, a dual system where violations within specific territories would be handled according to the traditions of whoever controlled that territory, but disputes that crossed borders would be mediated through mixed courts that would include representatives of both cultures. As the night progressed toward dawn, it became clear that they had accomplished something extraordinary. Not only had they established the basic principles for peaceful coexistence, but they had created a framework that could serve as a model for similar relationships in other regions. Marcus had filled multiple notebooks with detailed notes, but more importantly, he had worked with representatives from both sides to create visual records of the main agreements using symbols and diagrams that both cultures could interpret. The creatures had brought their own recording materials, metal plates that they engraved with specialized tools to create permanent representations of the most important points of agreement. The ceremony that marked the formal conclusion of the negotiations was a fusion of human and non human traditions, exchange of symbolic objects, purification rituals that each side recognized as significant, and even a form of shared music where human voices attempted to harmonize with the creature's complex vocal patterns. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, both delegations prepared to depart, but not before setting a date for a second meeting that would focus on practical implementation details. You realized that what had begun as a personal crisis had evolved into something that would permanently change interspecies relations in your region and possibly beyond. Lord Garrett took you aside before departing and informed you that reports of the negotiations were already being sent to the capital, where higher authorities were considering expanding the cultural intermediary program to other regions where non human communities existed. You have opened doors, he told you, that have been closed for centuries. The work you have done here could be the beginning of a new era in interspecies relations. His words filled you with a mixture of pride and apprehension because you realized that your life had changed irrevocably and that the responsibilities you now carried would extend far beyond your home village. In the days following the negotiations, your daily routine was completely transformed. Instead of working in the fields as you had done your entire adult life, you now spent your days studying legal documents, learning diplomatic protocol, and developing more sophisticated communication systems with the creatures of the forest. Marcus had become an invaluable collaborator, not only as a scribe, but as an advisor on matters of protocol and legal precedent. Clara had assumed management of the domestic aspects of your new position, coordinating with the official messengers who arrived regularly with updates and new instructions, and corresponding with authorities who required regular reports on the progress of the agreement's implementation. Your home had effectively been transformed into an unofficial embassy with regular visitors, including both human officials and occasionally emissaries of the creatures who came under the aegis of the new diplomatic protections. One of the most significant changes was in how the village itself responded to your new position. Initially, there had been confusion and some skepticism about rumors that you had established formal contact with the creatures of the Forbidden Forest. But when tangible benefits began to arrive, access to more effective medicines, knowledge of agricultural techniques that increased harvests, and even increased protection against bandits and other threats through discreet joint patrols, the village attitude shifted to one of cautious respect and eventual pride that their community had been chosen for this historic experiment. The elders, who had spent decades telling horror stories about the Forbidden Forest, gradually began to incorporate new elements into their narratives, tales of wise creatures who could be powerful allies to those who treated them with appropriate respect. The children, with the adaptability characteristic of their age, quickly accepted the new reality and began inventing games that incorporated peaceful interactions with forest creatures. But perhaps the most profound change was in your own understanding of the world and your place in it. For months, you had viewed your interaction with the creatures as extraordinary but fundamentally personal. Now, you realized that you had been part of a much broader process of evolution in interspecies relationships that was occurring in multiple places simultaneously. The communication networks that Master Aldrich had been documenting were not isolated phenomena, but manifestations of a fundamental shift in how different forms of intelligence were learning to coexist in a world that was becoming increasingly connected. Your role as an intermediary was not unique, but part of a new class of specialists that was emerging to navigate the intricacies of a more complex and diverse world. This understanding filled you with a sense of purpose that transcended the specific circumstances of your own situation and connected you to a broader historical movement toward understanding and cooperation among all forms of intelligent life. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, but now each change brought new evidence of how the agreements you had helped negotiate were transforming life in your region. Trade exchanges that had begun as cautious experiments had developed into mutually beneficial economic relationships that provided unique resources to both sides. Knowledge sharing programs had resulted in innovations that neither side would have developed independently, and most importantly, the next generation of both species was growing up with a natural understanding that cooperation was possible and beneficial, a prospect that promised even more harmonious relations in the future. When you reflected on all that had changed since that first desperate night, when you had entered the Forbidden Forest seeking medicine for Clara, you marveled at how a personal crisis had transformed into an opportunity that had changed not only your life, but the course of history itself. And each night, when you looked out at the forest that was no longer forbidden, but simply different, you felt a profound gratitude for having been chosen to be a part of something so extraordinary and meaningful.